Hello, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for this first Saibo's English live event. I'll be your host and moderator for the evening, Alex Stille. I'm the head of English language content here at Saibo's. So, the theme for today's discussion is going to be, can Japan compete for global talent? We've divided this broad topic into three themes. The first one, how is Japan doing in the global talent market? Then we'll talk about what it's like for foreign talent working in Japan. And finally, what future for Japanese businesses going global? Let me begin by introducing our lovely and distinguished panelists, starting with Rochelle Kopp. Rochelle is the founder and managing director of Japan Intercultural Consulting. Hello, Rochelle.
Hello.
Thank you for being here. Next to Rochelle, we have Casey Wall. Casey is the CEO of Attune and the founder of Wall & Case. Hello, Casey. Thank you for joining us.
Hello.
And last but not least, we have Yan Fan. Yan is the COO, and co-founder of Code Chrysalis. Thank you for having me. All right, let's get started. I'm super excited to talk to you all this evening. The first question I'd like to ask you, Rochelle. So, can you give us an overview of how you believe, in your opinion, that Japan is doing right now in the global market?
Oh, it's such a complicated issue because we've had the coronavirus in between.
Yeah.
So if you think in general of what enables a country to attract global talent, it's a combination of there being job opportunities, what types of job opportunities, how well do those opportunities pay, what kind of future or potential those jobs have, what's the quality of life in a country, and then there's all this intangibles of, is the country cool or a place you want to be? And then there's tax issues and things like that. And then there's the ability of actually to be able to get there and be able to work getting a visa. So on all those factors before the pandemic, Japan had pluses and minuses, and then on different things. And then we had the pandemic when no one could even come at all. So that was people wanted to come and couldn't, and people had jobs that they weren't able to actually come and take. So I knew a lot of people at my clients who were working remotely. And so I'd be doing a training session for a client, and I had people popping in from the UK or Mumbai or Canada and saying, oh, well, it's 2 a.m. here, but I can't come to Japan yet, and I'm still working for this firm. So I saw a lot of that. And so I think there's an additional factor with the whole pandemic and people suddenly not being able to come to Japan having kept people out for so long, and there was also the issue at the beginning of the pandemic of people, if they left, couldn't come back if they weren't Japanese. And so I think Japan has really taken a hit because of that. And so the question is, will some of the other good factors outweigh that?
So you say some of the other good factors. What do you mean by those good factors?
Okay, so I think the first thing is Japan has this coolness quotient.
Yeah.
That, Japan's culture is interesting, its food is delicious, it's a really pleasant place to live, your quality of living, safety are all terrific. And in fact, there was a study that was done back in 2020, so this is after the pandemic had started, of searches where people said they wanted to look to live if they were searching on Google. And Japan was number 2 across the world. Canada was number 1.
Oh.
However, Japan was the first choice for people in Canada, US, Australia, and most of Southeast Asia. So there are a lot of countries where Japan is the place people think, oh, I'd like to go there and I'd like to work.
I see. How about you two? Did you also feel that Japan has this kind of positive factor? What brought you here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a recruiting business, kind of one of the businesses under EQIQ, and I think brand Japan is extremely strong, extremely strong. Even with the pandemic, I think the people that, want to come for the culture, some component of the culture or their image of Japan hasn't changed, right? And I think some of the factors that Rochelle mentioned, like taxes, Japan doesn't usually get people that care about taxes too much, kind of anyways to come. I think for me, like the Olympic coverage, like Japan was getting a lot of negative coverage pre-Olympics, and keeping the borders closed to a certain degree, maybe some of the people on the edge started to kind of drift away, but still now we see the demands coming back. And I think anybody that had that dream, and usually it's a dream, at least for the people that we deal with, and it's something that they want to do and accomplish within their life. So I don't think the core kind of white collar demand has really changed, and I don't think it's going to change for a while.
Yeah, so I run a coding school in Tokyo, and a lot of people really see software engineering as a new path to Japan if you don't speak Japanese very well. So we do see a lot of demand, and as Rochelle and Casey were saying, the Japan brand is really strong. I know that we have lots of foreigners, people living outside of Japan, who are just waiting for the borders to open so they can attend boot camp and then find a job here. And I think what's really keeping people from moving to Japan is, there are perceived barriers to starting a life here. And I think that's what keeps a lot of people from pursuing that dream.
That's interesting. I'd like to hear more about that. So, what are these perceived barriers? And is Japan really taking advantage of this positive brand that you talk about?
I think Japan always mishandles its brand. Is kind of my opinion. They don't know how to tell their own story very well. Kind of going back to what Rochelle mentioned, it was Canada, the US, and Australia. I think there's quite large populations here, so it's almost word of mouth going back. Friends of friends or somebody in their community or a cousin's been here, type of thing like that. And I think if you have those connections, if you're coming and you know someone or of someone, then it's easy to get in. But I don't see tremendous amount of people coming without any exposure too much, and then it's quite difficult. Right?
Okay. Did you two also feel some sort of big cultural barriers that you weren't expecting when you came to Japan, or some disappointments in the image you had versus the reality here on the ground?
Well, the first time I came to Japan I was in college, and then afterwards I came to Japan to work, and I was expecting it to be really different. So I don't think that was a surprise. Of course, the specifics were always things that, I didn't expect this particular thing, but I knew it was going to be different.
Okay.
I came to Japan because I wanted to live here, right? It's just such a different experience from really Japan is a very unique place. There's a lot of wonderful things about living here. And for me, just like Rochelle, I was expecting it to be challenging in many ways. And I had also visited Japan several times before I actually moved here. So I felt like I was pretty familiar with at least what some of the surface challenges would be.
Do you have examples of some of the challenges that you actually faced when you got?
Oh, so pretty typically, starting a bank account is really difficult. Getting a mobile phone plan, finding housing is difficult. A lot of landlords, a lot of buildings won't rent to foreigners. That's a pretty common thing.
I think it's softening a lot, no?
It is softening a bit, for sure. And if you are working at a large company, that's not a big issue. But I think if you don't work at a large company, there is definitely some bias. And then, I think there's a lot of paperwork involved to getting your life set up here. Have to go to the ward office, which is an interesting experience here. So there were a few things like that. However, it was, I think, a little bit more difficult because I was trying to start a business here. And I think a lot of companies that do hire foreign talent tend to have someone in the office to at least help them out.
You would think so.
Yeah, you would think so.
Yeah. So this is, I think, part of the unique experience of talking to all three of you is that you've all founded your own business organization here in Japan, which is very, very impressive. I'm the only one here who is still in the kind of corporate, under the corporate umbrella of the Japanese company. I have time. Thank you. I have time. I just don't have any ideas. So when it comes to these barriers of entry, things like opening a bank account, a phone, things like that, what are some of the things you think that Japanese, on the government side and on the company side, could do to kind of make the process easier for foreign talent who wants to come?
HR practices, I think, is a big one. That could be like a separate panel discussion. But one example of that is the interview process. So a lot of Japanese companies really don't know how to interview and recruit when it comes to mid-level and senior talent. The recruitment process here is kind of much more like they hire straight out of university and people are in the company for life. And so when it comes to like mid-career changes, I still hear of people being given like Japanese essay, like timed essay tests. Have you heard of these? I was surprised.
Because they do those with college grads.
Yeah.
Right.
I was surprised that, one of my acquaintances like had to do that in a math test.
Yeah.
So there's just like these strange, like kind of recruiting HR practices, and that's just one example.
Yeah, the mid-management level is complicated because you have this kind of catch-22 of if you don't have anybody from abroad at the mid-management level to understand, you don't really know what would make things easier, and if things aren't easier, it's hard for people to get to the level of mid-management.
And I think there's also quite a bit of trying to make things look diverse, but maybe not as much time invested into, how to incorporate these different viewpoints. So a lot of times companies will hire foreigners, but then expect them to like Japanify themselves or Japanize themselves, right? Rather than kind of understanding how to incorporate or how to work and cooperate with those different viewpoints that they were initially trying to hire these foreigners for.
Yeah, well, I think it's a lack of understanding of why is it that we're hiring foreigners? That, well, we're hiring someone because it looks good in our diversity brochure, or we're hiring someone because they have certain skills that we can't get in the Japanese market. But coming along with that is different ways of thinking, different ways of approaching things, perhaps being more outspoken on certain things, a different culture. And having that different viewpoint actually, all scholars will tell you, leads to better outcomes if you appreciate those different viewpoints rather than trying to sort of smooth them over or quash them.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a diversity on paper only, but culturally you want them all to adapt to Japanese corporate style. That sounds like a complicated problem to deal with.
It's definitely complicated. Well, it makes me think of this young Korean woman that came to one of my seminars a couple years ago. And she had gone to a Japanese university, speaks fluent Japanese. And she went through the whole normal college recruiting process. And the company she joined, she had gone to a lecture by the president of the company who said, we want to bring fresh air into the company by hiring foreigners. And she thought, oh, this is going to be a great place for me. But then when she started the job, in her everyday work with her colleagues, anytime she does something that's different than what a Japanese person would do, she gets that kind of, nail that sticks up gets hammered down. And she came to my seminar and she said, well, if they want someone who acts exactly like a Japanese and thinks exactly like a Japanese, then why did they go to the trouble of hiring me? And so that's really the question.
So then, what recommendation would you give to these Japanese managers who are trying to hire foreign talent? Like, I understand, like, try to be open to their opinions and try to respect their diversity, but concretely, like, what does that mean for a manager?
Well, I think it means changing your expectations and realizing that people are going to behave in a different way and to be open to people behaving in a different way.
Yeah, I think it's important to separate style from efficacy. And I think people can get these mixed up sometimes. They're expecting a very Japanese style, but, maybe overlooking like maybe this other kind of style will also be equally effective. So it's important to have quantifiable benchmarks that, that managers can assess talent with, stuff that is not kind of biased by personal, like cultural expectations or things like that.
I think it's
Go ahead.
I think it's a really tough problem because I think Japanese government leadership and company government leadership really want this, right? And going back to these examples, and people come in and they come in with a dream, but once they get assigned to their manager, and usually it's probably an assignment, then the manager's like, what am I doing with this person? And that's the difficult part, right? And why does this manager have to do that? Well, the leadership says they want to do it, but they're not really into it. So something has to change at this mass management level, like culturally in the way they manage. And that's extremely difficult because that has to come intrinsically from that person. And there's probably a small cohort that, okay, I want this person to succeed, so I'm going to try hard. But other people are like, oh no, this is just a pain in the ass.
And when they don't know what to do, right? Well, actually, this advertising here, but my firm does seminars for Japanese who are managing non-Japanese staff, where we help give them some of the tools and help them know what to expect. But not that many companies do that kind of training, and so many managers like, okay, I have this foreign employee, and like they act really differently than anything I'm used to. What do I do with them? It's very stressful for them. And you're right, people just kind of get people dumped on them, right?
I'm kind of picking up on this advertising note, if I can advertise for a second. If you like, I think the good thing is with Attuned, we work with a lot of big Japanese companies, and the reason they buy Attuned and the software and the consulting that goes with it is because they want to change their culture and they want more psychological safety. And a lot of big Japanese companies, especially from the president's office or the kei kikaku, they want to change it from hierarchical, top down, to more interdependent kind of management style. Now, they don't know how to do it, and it's a beginning of a shift and a work in process to do this, but that's the only way I think they're going to force a change in these line managers. So I think there is hope for the future, but still kind of.
Where does that will come from? Why do they want to change from the hierarchical model that they've been using?
It goes back to innovation and agility. So I think like in this VUCA world, right, where everything's changing, you can't predict the future, what's going to change. And, Japanese companies with the domestic market shrinking to be more globally competitive, they have to be more agile. They have to understand local customers. They have to innovate much more aggressively type of thing. And to do that, you need everybody's voice, and especially the people closest to the customers. And it's not just this, charisma shacho or the charisma CEO that's a genius model, which kind of worked back in the 70s or 80s type of thing. We need everybody to understand it. And there's a real realization we have to shift like this to be competitive.
Yeah, there's a question of whether Japanese decision-making style is going to be effective for the creation of software and being ready for the 21st century. Japanese decision-making style is consensus-based and it's hierarchical. And so that can take a while, right, to get consensus with the team. The good thing about that is once consensus is made, it's faster. People, do get on and things move fast. But when it comes to an ever-shifting environment, say like the world shuts down and we go into a global pandemic, you need to be able to make decisions faster. And so, the whole like hierarchical consensus-based decision-making style is really great when you're doing like hardware, right? That where you need to be really precise. But if you look at the US sort of style of decision-making, it's the exact opposite from Japan, right? And it is top-down, so the top boss gets to make the final decision. And it's also egalitarian, which is really, I think, quite a shock for people who are not American or Canadian, right? In that it's egalitarian in that everyone is expected to voice an opinion, right? So it's like everyone's opinions are heard, and you can definitely say, like, I don't agree with this. But at the end of the day, the boss makes the decision, and everyone is expected to go along with that. And that, agile is in many ways kind of, I don't know if it's chicken or egg, but it's kind of from that. And it's made, I think, the Americans really good at creating software, right? So you see like the Germans and the Japanese having very similar decision-making styles. They're great with hardware, not quite as good with software. And it's because software is just such a different beast from hardware.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction because it's easy looking from the outside to be like, Japan has to change their ways and become more agile and more diverse in every aspect. But that's not necessarily true. Like there are industries where the Japanese way and honestly not being that diverse might work for them. They have to do the same thing very methodically again and again and have very fast communication with little innovation. But in this economy where you need more innovation to push yourself in the global market and compete with overseas.
Yeah, I would say, the things that I said, there's not an expectation that Japan adopts American culture. I think, though, that there has to be some sort of shift that happens whether it's like a mix or whether it's like different ways of work, something needs to happen in order for that innovation to trickle out a bit more.
Are the human resources even here? I mean, especially with the pandemic now and people who haven't been coming in for a while, it feels like a lot of talented foreign, overseas, skilled workers are gravitating towards foreign-owned companies in Japan as well, not necessarily traditional Japanese companies. So is there the talent for Japanese companies to diversify and then to later push innovation?
I think there is a lot of talent in Japan. I think there can be a tendency to grow a bit complacent. You know, with the way that a lot of Japanese companies are set up, people are severely underpaid in the early stages of their careers, and then severely overpaid, or quite overpaid, in the later parts of their career. And I remember going into meetings with Japanese customers, and there's like 30 people in the room, but there's only like 4 people having a meeting, and everyone else is kind of asleep. You'll notice like it's like 50, 60-year-old men on the sides, you know, kind of, and it's quite common here. So, you know, I think that makes it a little bit difficult when you are trying to be ambitious and push forward. It's not as meritocratic because you're sort of expected to stay at a company lifelong and work your way up. So that's one, I think, you know, cause of some of this complacency.
Yeah, I remember the first time somebody explained to me that old Japanese men closing their eyes was just a sign that they were listening very intently, falling asleep, what I would say.
And then they told you about Santa Claus or so. But like kind of going back to the question, if you don't mind, like I think for like engineers, there's jobs everywhere, like within engineers, whether it's foreign or Japanese, but like non-engineers, I think there's more within Japanese companies because most foreign companies, they're selling to the domestic market, right? And they don't necessarily want that many foreigners here. You know, just somebody to bridge to headquarters and they'll probably be sent over for the most part, right? There's only a few jobs. But I think Japanese companies to a whole wide spectrum want to hire foreigners. Some do it quite well, a minority maybe, but a lot want to do it. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. And you know, I took my MBA in Europe 7 or 8 years ago, and mostly Europeans, but now probably 20% of the class work for Japanese companies, not in Japan, but in Europe and kind of around the world. And they're very happy, and they've been there for years. And they're giving me a call, Casey, I'm about to work for a Japanese company. What should I do? What should I know? You know, so the talent is there.
Well, that's the important thing to remember. The Japanese firms hire thousands and thousands of people outside Japan. And they've also acquired a lot of companies outside Japan, and so they get all the talent when they buy a company, right? As long as they keep the people. So there's all those people, and a lot of Japanese firms bring people from their overseas operations to come work at their headquarters, and that's a really good way to bring people into Japan as well.
Excellent. Well, this is a great segue into our second topic to talk about the lives of these people who are being brought over. So I'd like to transition now to the second topic of our evening, which is, what is it like for foreign talent to work in Japan? And here I would like to give Jan the floor first. What kind of advice would you give for someone who's never been to Japan, doesn't know what it's like, but is coming over here to work for the first time?
I would say have goals and strategy. I think compared to other maybe labor markets, if you don't speak Japanese, you're very limited. And so because of those limitations, I think it's really important to know to have a goal of where you want your career to be and search and find ways to get there, whether it's, you know, within your current company or figuring out kind of, you know, what other companies you can go to. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I feel that disconnection a lot, but because Japan has a great brand, as you mentioned earlier, that people come here because of the brand, but without really thinking of their own career or how they're going to develop it.
Yeah.
Well,
I would also say that the foreigner community is quite small here, and so there's less opportunities for mentorship. There's maybe less role models out there, and if you don't speak Japanese, there is, you know, less diversity in the job pool. So I think, you know, just anecdotally, I've seen that be something that's drawn people away from Japan after living here a few years.
Yeah.
I'd say coming in kind of connected to that is low expectations is really good. You know, like if you're coming for that, you know, the cultural reasons you want to live here and that's there and you've got the job and you come, I see a lot of people that make it over that hurdle. They had the low expectations like, okay, you know, I got here, it's not the perfect job, I understand. But this is a relationship-driven economy. And even though the community of foreigners might be small, is once you build those relationships, you start getting, okay, here's the good jobs over here. Here's the company that does it well. And then you get the information, your foot is already in the door in Japan. And in my experience, people are always gonna hire a foreigner in Japan before they hire somebody abroad. Because there's always that worry they're gonna hate the food, whatever it might be, and they're gonna leave really quick. After we put in all this investment, their social capital within the company, if they hire somebody from abroad and they leave 6 months later, like their reputation is ruined. So if I can find a foreigner here that can do the job pretty well and they've already been here, then okay, it de-risks the Japanese company. So I think you look in that first one, okay, I'll get my door in Japan. It might not have the salary the best way or it might not have the best talent, but you can leverage that pretty quickly in different places.
Yeah, that sticking to it is really important. I think a lot of people, their first job in Japan tends to be, well, there's a lot of the same. There's a lot of people who come and teach English for a while, and then from there move on. And I think you know this very well.
Yeah.
Opportunity.
A lot of our customers tend to be like English teachers or recruiters who, that you know, it was their first job, and they're thinking maybe I want to do something else, but they still want to stay in Japan.
That's how I started out as well. 2 years of teaching. Glad I got out. Anyway, so another thing I was wondering is then, what is the cultural appeal of working here? If you don't know about Japan, if you've never been here, like what kind of benefits are you getting by working in a Japanese?
Well, I'll just speak for myself. You know, my big motivation when I came to Japan after college and wanted to work for a Japanese company is I wanted to understand how do Japanese companies work. And the best way to do that is to actually see them from inside. So the 2 years that I spent in a big Japanese company was just invaluable for me because I understand what makes them tick. And so that's what I really wanted to get out of it, and I was able to.
Do you feel like that changed the way that you worked, or that changed the way you communicate with people, having that experience?
Well, you know, one thing I did find working in a Japanese company is I felt it made me a significantly better writer in English because I was writing memos and different things, reports for non-native speakers. And if I wasn't clear in what I was writing, it wasn't going to work for them. So I had to really improve my writing skills, actually. And I thought I was a pretty good writer to begin with before that, but it made me much more conscious of how I communicate.
How about you two? Did working in Japan bring you some new knowledge or some new cultural awareness that you maybe didn't have before?
Yeah, I think a tremendous amount. Like speaking with my entrepreneur hat on is one thing that I think is very special about Japan is it's not a very competitive economic market, I think. So especially as an entrepreneur, if you have relationships and you generally know your domain, I think you can survive quite well. And, you know, scaling to a few $1 million is not so hard. It's hard, but it's not so hard. I think the way the Japanese industries are set up is almost every industry has their top player, right? And they're kind of the legacy player and they're not going to be disrupted. Then there's the second player and they're big enough just to keep the first player honest, but they're never going to become the first player, and everybody kind of knows that. And then the third player is much smaller, and then there's all these opportunities, and Japan's just inefficient, going back to the relationship driven, like there's a lot of possibilities to create new services, you know, fill a niche and exist and survive. And as long as you have those relationships, and also going back to that cultural component is learning how to apologize and like, just, yeah, I'm sorry, I'll fix that and stick with it. That's probably the biggest thing. And those relationships will stick with you for 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, I think on the consumer side, they have very high standards for services and products. And I think I've learned a lot from just seeing how that plays out. I think just also awareness. It's refreshing being the foreigner in a new environment or in a very different environment, and just getting to know yourself and how much you're affected by your upbringing has been really great learning. So it's been a lot of fun living here, I would say, and starting a company here. A lot of things that I think I've learned here about myself that I don't think I would have learned if I had stayed in San Francisco or in the US.
Yeah, I think that's very important, having that kind of foreign experience as a way to understand your own biases, your own perception. Absolutely. Kind of flipping the question then, what are the things that you would like to teach Japanese colleagues, or that you wish that more of the Japanese people you worked with knew about multiculturalism?
Well, kind of the top thing that I usually like to teach, and I do this a lot in my seminars, is feedback skills. That typically in Japanese culture, people don't give a lot of feedback, either positive or negative. And that's usually one of the top things that non-Japanese who work in Japanese organizations feel uncomfortable about. If you're not sure what you're doing wrong, you don't know what to fix. And if you're not getting the positive feedback about what you're doing well, it's easy to just, kind of become disengaged or unmotivated. So I think becoming more comfortable and more skilled in giving feedback is probably the top thing I'd recommend for Japanese.
That's a really hard one. That's one I struggled with as well, because to give feedback, you kind of have to understand the job that the person you're giving feedback to is doing.
Right.
But if you're hiring a foreigner to do a job that you're not able to do, how do you give them feedback?
Well, yeah, you have to be able to talk about specific actions that they took, and then what was the result of that action. So you did this thing, and here's the problem that happened. Or you did this thing, and here's the wonderful result, and everyone was happy. So you have to at least, even if you don't completely understand the job, you have to be able to identify what they did. Because it's either an action that you want them to stop doing, or it's something that you want them to continue.
Yeah, that's...
Say how to make mistakes and fail. Failure and mistakes it's such an important part of becoming a software engineer. Like your default is failing. Like it's a failing test or an issue, and you have to turn that into something that works. And so I think there's such a perfectionist culture. People are very afraid to make mistakes, and that can be tough when you're, for example, learning to be a software engineer, but it can also be applied to everyday life, to your career. For me, I don't think progress is possible without making mistakes along the way, just on the road to learning, to figuring things out. So probably embracing and seeing failure as something to learn from rather than just as failure.
How do you break that stigma, though, with Japanese? So difficult.
I think in my experience for my business, we're training software engineers, and I think a part of that is getting that hands-on experience. We try to really reframe thinking. So, if, for example, what we say is, if you're getting a different error message, that's a good thing, because it means you're making some kind of progress, right? If you're changing that error message from error 1 to error 2, like that's a good thing. You're making progress. So I think just hands-on experience like that, and understanding that we're all learning, we're all growing every day. We should be able to look back on the work that we did, and if we're cringing at it, or if we're feeling like, oh, that could be better, that's a good thing. It means that we've grown in that time.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions I find myself asking a lot then is, like, there are expectations that foreign talent have toward Japanese people in terms of, as you said, giving more feedback, or being less perfectionist, or accepting a more maybe confrontational way of having conversations and meetings. And then there's expectations from the Japanese side for foreign talent in terms of, like, respecting the harmony and kind of, rocking the boat, but not in a way that's going to be impolite or just not too much. And I was wondering, like, how do you find that balance? How do you find that balance between how much foreign talent's supposed to adapt to the Japanese style and how much Japanese style is supposed to adapt to kind of to bring foreign talent?
Well, it really has to be both. Really, both sides need to make an effort. And unfortunately, I see too many people who are always expecting the other side to make all the effort. Hey, you come over here to my culture side. Yeah. And it's really easy to fall into that. And so it really needs to be both sides.
I think what I've seen is many foreigners try to come to adapt, and initially adapt, then start to reject at a certain point. And I guess this is a trend, like people I find like have a 2-year line, right? And if they make it over the 2-year line in Japan, then they stay for a long time, 5, 7, 10, 15, how many ever years. But otherwise it's about 18 months. I hate this country and I'm out at right around the 2-year mark type of thing like that. But the ones who make it over that, I think the Japanese side starts to conform more to them in the successful cases. And I think the Japanese companies that really not only doing it, as window dressing, but really investing, and they deeply believe into it, like, okay, yeah, we want you to kind of break the rules. We want you to kind of skip some of the processes a little bit. We want you to say no in meetings type of thing. It's not going to fix everything, but that's what we want out of you. And then kind of both sides come to a stasis. And I've seen that kind of example many, many times over where, okay, both sides seem to be relatively happy with the arrangements.
Yeah, that's very sensible, I think. But then the thing that I feel like I've witnessed as well in being kind of the foreigner in the room is that you're trying to play that role, but because you're the only one playing that role, you don't really know if you're doing it right. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. Like, I mean, I'm not in a Japanese company now, but I have to give like speeches to Japanese companies, our customers, and I'm giving my big foreigner speech type of thing like that. And it's kind of like nodding. Okay, did this work? Did this not work? So I can understand.
Yeah, it goes back to what you said. It's really hard to get feedback from, and then to know if you're pursuing the right route.
I'm still trying to figure it out. Looking to these two for wisdom and advice.
Just look to your right, I'll look to my right.
Yeah, that perennial advice on how to break that barrier. It is complicated, but I have witnessed what you're talking about as well, of those like phases, right? The first phase is that kind of enamored honeymoon phase of you come to Japan and everything's rosy, and anytime somebody complains, you're like, they're a curmudgeon complaining about Japan, what's going on? And then 2 years later, you're like, wait a minute, I have a lot of things to complain about myself.
Right.
And it gets kind of hard as well, not only within a company, but just like within society in general, to know, am I allowed to complain? How much complaining is too complaining? When am I just the loud foreigner doing things that nobody wants to hear?
Well, Japanese complain a lot. A lot. In society and in companies.
On Twitter?
Yeah, on Twitter, with multiple accounts. I think it's just the method of outletting and what we expect as that feedback loop for our complaint to be quickly addressed, or at least acknowledged, where maybe it just goes quiet to a certain.
All right, let's transition then into our third theme of the evening, if that's all right with you. And that is, let's talk a little bit about the future. So the third theme is, what future for Japanese businesses going global? And here I'd like to give it to Casey. First of all, what is the risk for Japanese companies who don't go global? Why is this important?
I think they're just going to die, right? Don't want to kind of quote too many of Elon Musk's tweets, but right? Like Japan's going to go to 0 people in 300, 400 years type of thing like that. But no, like jokes aside, like the market is shrinking, right? And I think if you want to retain people and have good people, you have to grow. And if you're in a shrinking market, it's very difficult to grow, right? So you have to go abroad, outside. And just the demographics show that's going to happen. So I think a lot of Japanese companies, even for the last 15 years, but even more so in the last 5 or 7 years, that we have to do this fast and aggressively. And there's been a whole bunch of failures. And going back to that failure point, I don't know how many people pick themselves back up after failure, because society doesn't necessarily accept failure, but people are failing and trying, and it's moving the whole societal conversation forward. So I think Japanese companies are trying to go global, a lot more of them, and especially younger ones. And there's at least around kind of my age, like this 30, 40, 50-year-old, especially like founders, there's this real desire to make the next Sony and like the next great Japanese company and brand kind of globally. And, nobody's really figured it out. And I think for most Japanese companies, there's kind of two directions. You either go to Southeast Asia or generally you go to the US is what I've seen. And it's binary. You take one or the other type of thing like that. But there isn't a repeatable model. But I think the Japanese companies like to share. This is what we do. Like, a lot of events and they talk about it. So, once you start to get a couple of patterns, I think you're going to see more and more people following that.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of Japanese companies who think they can survive purely on the domestic market. And then another thing is that in going global, you talked about failure, but I feel like a lot of Japanese companies who try to go global also fail very slowly over a long period of time. Is that just my own impression?
We won't name names.
Oh, and that kind of...
If you're still in the game, it's not failure, there's still a chance.
Slow death.
And I know that a lot of tech companies in the US, I mean, Facebook had that famous motto of like, what is it, move fast and break things or something.
Right.
Which ruins society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of things.
Yeah, that's a whole other problem, right?
I think there's not that sense of urgency or ambition that, I wasn't around then, but I heard a lot about in the 80s and early 90s when Japanese companies were the majority of the top 50 largest companies in the world. And now I think in the top 50, only one is there. It's just Toyota, whereas before, 1989, 30 or 35% of the world's largest companies were Japanese. So yeah, there is that sense of urgency and ambition, but I think it's still within a small part of the population. And that brings me back to what I talked about earlier with complacency. Life is really good here. And I think you can have a pretty good life without, for example, reaching for the moon and the stars. And I think a lot of Japanese companies are kind of falling into that trap as well. They're sitting on lots of cash.
Right.
That's a really big one. I remember at the start of the pandemic, there was one company that was boasting about how it could survive without making any money for the next 40 years or something like that. Was that right?
They had such a big cash cushion.
Yeah, cash cushion.
I forgot who that was, but yes.
Yeah, it was like some Japanese company. And so, I think a lot of these things could maybe be spurred on by some very controversial, policy decisions, right? For example, increasing the minimum wage, which is controversial here. It's a very low minimum wage in Japan, but that minimum wage, by increasing it, it might spur companies to really think about productivity and how they can increase worker productivity.
Not just the minimum wage, all wages really should go up.
Exactly. Yeah, all wages need to go up. That's another thing when it comes to attracting foreign talent, right? I think a lot of people are trading that higher salary for the Japan factor of comfortable life,
Right.
good food, safety. Yeah, but that might be great for attracting young talent, but when they get to their 30s, I think they might want to look for something different.
I think it's a case of what got you here won't take you there. So what makes you successful in Japan as a company is the exact opposite things that'll make you successful in the US, and it's vice versa. And that's why over the years I've seen so many US tech companies fail, they're gone in 2 years. It's from the US side, it's speed and aggressiveness and going back to move fast and break things, and that's how they can grow very fast, and that becomes their culture of the organization. Then they come here in Japan and it doesn't work like that. Whereas Japan is relationship driven. Okay, we'll take time. We understand it might take a year to meet that key person we want to. We're going to have those meetings every 2 months, but we get it and they're going to be a customer for 10 years type of thing like that. So it's this culture of success in Japan, and going back to, we want to be stable and we want to have lots of capital, and this is seen as good. We're rewarded socially for doing this as, Keisha, but those aren't the things that are going to make you there. So there's a lot of unlearning that needs to happen at that switch about whole different culture the organization needs to have. And then how do those two coexist? I think it's quite difficult.
Yeah, I think that's the big question then. Yeah, how do those two coexist? Because would there be then like an entirely separate management for the overseas part of the company? But then you run into that problem of when you look at the career paths for foreign talent, it's like the highest position any foreign talent can get is king of the foreigners, and then there's nowhere to go from there. And
like you said, I don't think that one works, right? Like we tried to do just manage them separately, but then it'll be a slow death, right? You probably don't have the best talent that accepts a king of the foreigners type of thing.
Right, exactly. And the thing is, you're seeing now a lot of Japanese companies that are bringing non-Japanese into pretty senior positions. And so I know my firm does a lot of work with companies that are bringing in like executive vice presidents. Either it's someone from outside the company, a really talented person they're bringing in, or they're often bringing people from their foreign operations and then bringing them in to senior positions in Japan. So that's something you see happening more, where they're diversifying the upper ranks of the company.
how's that been working?
Well, in some places it's working really well, some places it did not work very well. So it's definitely a mixed bag, but enough companies are seeing the need for it that they keep trying.
I think that trying is really important, right? You can't get it right in the first go. And different companies will have different needs. Different companies will learn to adapt at a different pace.
Right.
But I think it's good that we're seeing that happening. And even in the past 5 years that I've lived in Japan, I've seen so much change, just in terms of, the different things that the government has been trying, right? Putting out new policies. Like now there's like multicultural language centers, information centers that you can call into if you're a foreigner. Like that wasn't a thing when I first got here. There's also been a lot of efforts from companies as well.
All of this coinciding with the pandemic, where now there's just not as many foreigners coming in the first place. Yeah. How do you see that moving forward in terms of like Japan opening up and having to welcome new talent? Has the ship already sailed? Like I feel like a lot of companies now who are looking at, for example, Asian headquarters are looking more toward maybe Singapore or other hubs.
Well, U.S. firms are doing a lot of that, yeah.
Is there any hope that maybe Japan can become the hub of Asia for these big international companies in the future? Already gone.
That's gone. Everyone's going to Singapore or Seoul, which was really surprising, right? New York Times moved their headquarters to Seoul.
Right. And that's actually where the tax thing does matter for those American firms with their highly paid executives. The tax differential just, I think that alone takes Japan out of the ranking for a lot of firms.
Yeah. I think there was an opportunity for some tax reform to attract financiers from Hong Kong, because there's been a mass exodus from Hong Kong, and I think maybe 2008, but also the Tohoku crisis, there was a lot more financial activity happening, like a lot more foreign firms and foreign financiers were in Japan.
I see like every 10 years, like Japan's like, we want to be the financial hub here.
Yeah.
Like, we try, we have some
exactly.
policies we make, and then it fails. And then 10 years later, we want to do it again, and it fails.
Yeah, it's like a recurring theme.
It's never going to happen.
No, and it's like it's some category on some bureaucrat's PowerPoint that just never gets erased, right?
Well, I mean, it's the taxes, right? Like the taxes level isn't going to change. And I think for these financial firms and the headquarter firms, taxes is a really big issue. And that's not going to change for Japan, and they're not going to be competitive for that. And there's too much social structure, the demographics, all the bills that they have to pay for elderly people and everything. That's not going to change that. And all these other things, we can compete on this and this and this, but no, this one doesn't.
But it's the corporate taxes, but it's also the taxes on the individuals.
Exactly.
Who get their foreign assets, et cetera, become taxed, and that's so different than other countries.
Even if you don't have foreign assets, I mean, Singapore tax rate's like 15-20%. Here in Japan, the highest tax bracket, you're taxed at 55%.
Can I just say controversially, I like paying Japanese taxes, and I'm happy to do it. And I've been a beneficiary. Recently had a baby in the hospital for a long time that got extremely good medical care for a very low amount of individual money. So we've been beneficiaries for this. So all of my taxes for the rest of my life, I'm happy to pay to Japan. And I don't think you hear that too many times in panels.
Well, I have lived in Singapore, and the medical care was equally good.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
and
Touche.
at like 15-20% tax rate. So, but yeah, I do agree. We are making that trade-off. Life is really nice here in Tokyo or here in Japan, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of it almost feels like we're moving toward that kind of Scandinavian model of like you get a good life where nobody's going to be in extreme poverty and you have all these social benefits, but at the same time you're going to pay.
Japan's also corporatist as well, so it's not like cutthroat capitalism like America, right? Type of thing. It's corporatist, meaning we are capitalist, or sorry, I'm saying we, but Japan is corporatist, but society is a little bit like more.
I do worry about Japan's future, though, because, things have been pretty stagnant, and global inflation has been happening in Japan. So the yen has been getting weaker and weaker. The amount of stuff that people can buy here, and Japan is a country that relies a lot on imports, right? So Japanese people can afford fewer and fewer things as the years go by, and now we're hearing about, firms in China being competitive salary-wise to Japan, which I think 10 years ago no one would have ever thought. Right. But we're seeing an exodus of anime artists going over to China because they're getting paid more. Right. So
you're starting to see top-selling books about how can you lead a good life on 2 million yen salary and that's a whole genre about how to live well on lower amounts of salary.
I do worry about Japanese society and how they can keep up.
Yeah. The countermeasures you hear about in that sense tend to be like move back to the countryside where it's cheap, but that's not.
Quite nice.
Well, this kind of goes along with my theory. I think basically Japan is going to become like Italy.
Yeah.
We all love Italy. We love Italian food. We love Italian products like clothes and shoes and handbags. And we love to visit Italy. And Italy makes some cutting edge products and, some industrial goods that are very important. But it's not one of the economies that's driving the world. But it's a very pleasant place. And I kind of feel like Japan is headed to be like Italy.
I feel like the leaders in Japan, though, don't like that idea, right? They want Japan to be global.
I think all business leaders and government leaders, they want to keep it, try to be number two again,
So that disconnect with the leaders in Japan and this middle management, it's.
But is that something that you want them to accept and just lean into? Okay, we're
I don't know. It's hard to say. Like, we're saying all of these ways that Japan can improve, but I think on the flip side of that, it's like, how might that impact Japanese society? Would that change, this life that we so appreciate in Japan, right? And I think that is something we need to think about as well.
There was some famous person, I want to say it might have been Donald Ritchie, who said, if you changed all the things that we as foreigners hate about Japan, it would no longer be Japan anymore, or no longer be the Japan that we love anymore.
Yep.
That is very important, yeah. But if you don't change anything, then it also won't be the Japan we love anymore either, because of all the forces that are kind of pulling from the sides. So, if you were face to face with a Japanese CEO right now who is really worried and wants a better future for Japan, what would you recommend that they do that within their company that could make things better in the long run?
Buy all of our services, I think.
What is the second?
Train everyone to make the code, get full of new talent, lots of cross-cultural leadership training,
We've got it solved here.
Yeah.
So I would just What about the seniority and lifetime employment principle? Do you think that this is an important thing for Japanese companies to conserve moving forward, or is this something that they have to look towards?
And that needs to change. And there's so much pushback from young Japanese people too.
They're not interested in it anymore.
Yeah, they do not like it. So I think even without foreigners, that's going to change.
And it is gradually changing already, yes.
We
Little
see
by
it changing
little.
a lot
Yeah.
faster, right? So like 20 years ago in recruitment, you never saw a person leave a Japanese company. Then it became every 10 years. Now it's like every 5 years. Now it's every 3 years. So the pace and the frequency is much, much faster. But I think as Japanese leaders and business leaders, and they are older, like part of the incentive of the social incentive of being a CEO or a business leader is you protect your workforce, right? And that's what the bank tells you, and that's what the government tells you. Don't make profit. We don't want you to make much profit in Japan. We want you to hire more people and take care of your people and give them safety and stability. So they've been trained like this. They've been socially rewarded like this for a long time. So it's very hard to break that down.
It leads to issues like, out of all the OECD countries, Japan ranks the lowest in terms of self-improvement outside of work. It's a very low percentage, and it's because of this kind of mindset of like, if I join this company, I'll be taken care of. The company will provide me the training that I need.
People don't have to manage their own careers.
Yes.
I see. Yeah, you do see that a lot of that kind of that given track that you have. And then coming in as a foreigner, though, it's hard to get on that same track. Like, your career is not really managed the same way as a new hire that enters into a Japanese company.
Well, the thing is that that's being a seishain, and a lot of non-Japanese would not want that because then you're putting yourself at the mercy. You can get transferred to another location at the drop of a hat, and you're not in charge of your career, and not many non-Japanese would want to go that route. Sorry.
I think somewhere else you kind of likened it to indentured servitude type of thing like that. Like where they can,
Right.
you're
It
at the
is
will at the
basically,
company.
yeah, it is basically how it works.
It also makes it really difficult to have a family life because you could be transferred at the drop of a hat.
Right.
So if you've got, a family, what does that mean for your spouse who's also working? Right?
Yeah, I mean, recently I've been in this kind of pandemic bubble where I don't really leave the house, so I can't really imagine when I getting transferred anywhere. But is this still very common within Japanese companies?
Oh yes,
All the time?
extremely,
Very
yeah.
common.
Just happened every March and April, right?
Right, exactly, like clockwork.
Yep.
I see.
Yeah.
Just shuffle everyone up, right?
It's not just transferring locations, it's also just transferring departments sometimes.
Right.
Like you just get put in a completely different department. And that had its benefits, I think, back then, but mindsets are changing now.
Well, it doesn't make sense anymore.
Right.
I had an interesting call one time. I got asked by a Japanese colleague to talk to a Japanese company that was going to be doing software and development internally for the first time. So they were, before that, they had always farmed it out to SI companies. And so they were putting together this team of software engineers, and I was giving them all sorts of advice on, things that they might want to consider when they were doing this. And then we get to the end of the call, and one of the people on their team says, well, what do we do when it's time for the internal personnel shuffle and we send these people to other departments? And I was just so shocked, and I said, you don't. and he's like, but we have to. I'm like, why? And he said, well, the head of the company feels really strongly that everyone in the company needs to experience all the departments. And I said, if you try and transfer these hotshot software engineers you're hiring, they're all going to quit. Because they chose to be software engineers, and they don't want to be sent to accounting or sales or anything else.
Yeah, and you don't want all your accountants to become first-time software engineers either.
It probably won't work either unless they go to Code Chrysalis.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, yeah. I think we've kind of gone around all of the major issues that I wanted to talk about. Is there any final thoughts that you would like to add? Anything you'd like to tell our viewers, listeners, future people who will view the archive?
I think the things that Japan needs to do in order to attract more foreign talent, these are also going to be beneficial things for just Japanese workers. I think society is moving towards that direction. We're already seeing so much change. So I think Japan's level in the world is going to rise. Maybe not quite as fast as we would like it to, but it is changing, and people and companies and governments are trying.
Yeah, I think it's generational. So going back to it's not fast. Like, I think, old people have power, like government power and a lot of economic power. And I think people in their 40s and 45, when they start to take it in the next 10, 15 years, like the core power, you're going to see some more dynamism, but especially like, you know, the guys and girls that are in their 20s and 30s right now, like when they take power, I think you're going to see a very, very different Japan. Like they don't want everything that we've talked about for the most part. Right? So I think you're going to see more dynamism, more change as the generations shift. And it's going to be hard before then.
Well, I'd like to end on a hopeful note. Yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up everything I wanted to talk about. Thank you so much, all three of you, for joining this panel, for sharing your thoughts. I certainly learned a lot. I hope our viewers did as well. Thank you for joining us. Those viewing the archive, thank you for tuning in. And yeah, I hope to see you all next time for a future event. I hope to keep in touch with all three of you as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.